I think this first one needs to come to you, Auntie Grace, because it is about the 1967 referendum, and that, during that time, we know that there was a range of people and experiences, and lots of things were going on at that time leading up to the referendum. And some people that may be listening in today, watching in, and some of the people that are helping us with the panel, may not have been born at that time, and other people were born and maybe children, and others were adults. And we saw that beautiful photo, the image at the start of 1967 that was here at the University of Queensland, and people campaigning at that time. Auntie Graceland, what are your experiences of 1967? What can you remember at that time? What instills in your mind?
Yeah, 1967, I was around 17 years of age, and a lot of political stuff was going on, and I'd also started my nurse's training. But I was privileged to be attending so many political meetings in Townsville. Dr. Roberta Sykes, the late Dr. Roberta, was also in Townsville, but I had the privilege of being a 13-year-old and going to meetings with the late Dr. Evelyn Scott, the late Uncle Koiki Mabo, which is 30 years next year, going to little humble houses, my grandparents. And so I guess from a very young age, I had all that politicisation and the human rights just really spoken about freely around these incredible elders. And in 67, we knew this massive referendum was coming up. Well, not so much a referendum. I thought, there's all these people, my parents and grandparents were saying is going to Canberra. And of course, we all know what happened. The four magnificent men, one still going, Gilla Anderson, but it was an amazing year, and not just for me, but for First Nations Australians, because there were so many white folks that were supporting us. And, a dad gone to sent to Palm Island at the age of 3, and I spoke about that this morning at Sorry Day, and never returned to 18. And he caught up on so much lost time. And so I remember, and I couldn't get there, but I'd collected money from my family, and not very much. Everyone was so poor. But I remember ringing or contacting a Dr. Bobby Sykes and said, look, not very much, but a lot of poor people have put some money towards this, and even if it's for tea and bickies. And of course, we heard about the referendum, and Cormac Perkins was on the scene, and I thought, all these powerful people, and Arnie Ujnaroon, just amazing people, the Watsons and the Gary Foleys of the world. And so I was privileged to be around that year, privileged to be very political, and privileged to be very cultural. So 67 has stuck with me, and I've been writing a daily diary well before 1967, so I'm hoping my book's going to come out. So they were my precious feelings. And sorry, I've probably taken a bit of your hours.
No, that's lovely, and lovely.
All other beautiful people here.
No, that's lovely to hear. Even that sense of, having to get money together and raise money to help other people to get down there, and the feeling there of the support, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people together at that time. Together. I'm going to throw to you, Tracy, and Norm. Any thoughts about that time, or things you may have heard about that time?
I'll let Norm talk first, Bron.
Yeah. You're on mute, Norm.
Sorry about that. Yeah. At that time, I was in a Catholic boarding school
Mm.
at around 15, 14, and in trouble every day. Quite an interesting place to be in because we had no contact with the outside world at all. Very little contact, and some kids, no transistor radios, no way of hearing what was going on in many ways. So I was totally oblivious to all of this and really just consumed with dealing with the trouble that was on us as 15-year-old, 14-year-old kids in a very strict environment. So
Yeah.
that environment was dehumanizing. It was something that had its positives. Some of it was positive. I learnt to read and write very, very well. I also learnt to argue, and I learnt to take beatings. Those were normal things for us in that context. Looking at it, I think that was about that time I left under not very good circumstances. When you cause too much trouble,
Yeah.
you were just out of there, and found myself in a small country town in a high school with things there that weren't anywhere else, weren't part of my main experience. So it was, a very big transition that year for me as a very troublesome young man.
Mm. Thank you, Norm. Tracy, Professor Bunda.
Hi, everybody. In 1967, I was 6 years of age.
Wow.
So I was a little girl. I was looking at that black and white photo, you know, that held everybody together until we started. And I was thinking about, I think crocheted dresses were in fashion.
Mm.
I think my mom was making crocheted dresses for me, height of fashion. Look, one of the memories that I have from being a little girl at that time, you know, in your town, there's always a designated building where you go and vote. And I can remember holding the hand of my mom or dad and going to that place. Now, whether that was in 1967 or not, I can't remember. I'll have to backtrack with my family. I have thought about this before. Now, one of the things that about my family, particularly my dad was a bit cheeky, huh? He was a serviceman. And so come 1967, he had already served this country. He was a Rat of Tobruk, and then they were called back. The 9th Division were called back to Australia and then retrained. And then they went to Townsville, actually. And then from there, they were deployed out into the Pacific. And knowing my dad, I reckon he would have been saying, you know, I defended this country as a soldier, as a black man. So if there's an opportunity for me to vote, I will vote, you know. And in the 1960s, where I come from, I was born in Ipswich because both of my parents were incarcerated there at the Salvation Army Mission, which was paradoxically called Purga. Can you have a mission that's called purgatory for blackfellas, please? And that was closing down at the end of the 50s. And so there had been this really sharp division, apartheid between this is where all the Aboriginal families live and this is where all the white families live. And that boundary was just starting to break down a little bit. And some of the Aboriginal families were moving, you know, closer into town in that 1960s, you know. I mean, you get a sense of that in that black and white photograph that we started off with, hey? Like there's a little hint of the revolution there, you know?
Yeah, thank you, Trace. Dylan, do you want to comment on anything there about 67 at all?
Well, you may have guessed, but I can't speak from any personal memory.
Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
not going to be born for another, I can't do maths very well, 18 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, no, but I mean, you know, from having sort of come to this as a scholar and a student, and trying to understand a bit more about Australia's history and about Australia's constitutional history, it's clear that this was a really momentous event for the country and for the treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And it was really transformative in the way that the government, the Australian state, dealt with Aboriginal people, in particular, in shifting the responsibility, not just constitutionally, but I think in a political sense, from the sort of the states with their, you know, all of their mixed and, you know, variously discriminatory and sort of often despotic regimes of protection and control and assimilation, to the Commonwealth, in the hope that it would be a more kind of accountable and enlightened government to deal with, that would sort of give First Nations people a better deal. You know, it was more accountable to the international sphere, you know, and this of decolonisation, and, you know, moment of the Cold War, and Australia was really concerned about its reputation. So it was a really important shift and a transformative one.
Yeah, that's good to hear that, because I'm going to move on to, from that legalistic point of view, and you being, you know, the studying back and reflecting back on the law and policy at that time. And we've got Norm and Tracy and Auntie Grace here who were living at that time, and Tracy's already said how, you know, her father had fought for the country and but didn't have the capacity to vote, and so that would have brought some changes for him and the family that occurred at that time. But we've got people here that have all been change makers and are considered change makers, each of you in your own right. What do you think in terms of what Dylan's described there of the changes? Did you see those changes happening after then you were part of that, or living through that 1967? What changes from that time up until now have you noticed? That what difference did it make? I'll maybe go to you first, Tracy.
Okay, I got a bit of a strange story for an Aboriginal person. So in 1972, my dad was posted to Malaysia. And so we were living in Malaysia for a couple of years. And 1972 was really an important time, you know, like Grayson was talking about before, you know, the activism, you know, within communities was building. And, you know, we had the Aboriginal Tent Embassy set up. And so one of the things that I loved about having that experience of living in Malaysia in my formative years, was that I knew brown people could run a country. I lived it. I saw it every single day. Brown people ran a country. Brown people did it in their own language, and brown people did it within their own, you know, systems and stuff. So that was sort of like revolutionary for me. And then I come back to Australia and I finished my high school in the 70s. And, you know, I come from really strong parents who were just resistance fighters, you know, like, you know, they were just bucking the system in the mission. They were bucking the system when they were in employment outside of the mission system, you know. And so that DNA is obviously going to pass on into my family, you know. So it wasn't until much later when I was a young woman, you know, and we had street marches in Brisbane, you know, that I then joined the likes of, and you've got the formation of, you know, FARA happening in Brisbane. And so that was what was happening for me, because I'm a little bit younger than Norm and Graceland.
Yeah. We might move to you, Norm, just to look at what you know, because you said you came out of the, you know, the boarding school to living in a town, and then your difference from 1967 and how you were feeling at the time. What's changed in that time from your perspective? What changed at that time, and then what's changed since that time?
Well, those small country towns in northern Victoria, southern New South Wales and western New South Wales,
Yeah.
Nobody was Aboriginal. Nobody would say that word in those days before 67. There was always a silence, and you would find out, you know, the connections in private. You know, nobody would talk publicly about those things. And, you know, a few years before, Charlie and that crew had travelled around through different towns, and it spread the idea that, hey, there's an identity here that you have to speak about. And people started speaking about those things. One of the families that I was close to back in those years was a Clark family, major Aboriginal family. Nobody said, oh, we're Aboriginal. But if you went places and you tried to do things, there was this silent sort of retribution. So they call it a touch of tar or other things and other words I won't say. But I remember, you know, in those years working for farmers and going to order stuff for farms and finding it really difficult. And other people would be charged less. Other people would be served first. Those sorts of things in those towns are silent controls. And that silence was broken in those years. And people started to talk and started to activate about these imposed rules that are very, very strict and Victorian rules. I was in quite a bit of trouble there, but I did meet up with some really important people in those years as well. Particularly one uncle who's passed, Uncle Tom's. He helped me by saying to me when I was angry and violent, you're going to turn out just like the people who did that to you. And those sort of connections became possible for me, and I really valued them.
Yeah.
I valued them more than anything else. So those changes at a personal level and at a small community level, they were really, really quite huge, because people became aware for the first time in those places of what was silenced and ignored.
Yeah. Thanks, Norm. Auntie Graceland, because we heard from you first last time in the round, and I want to ask you, you know, about the 1967. Having done the things you've done, what has changed since that 1967 period? You know, when you were raising money, even if it was tea and biscuits, or people travelled to Canberra to rally and campaign at the time ahead of the referendum, and then the referendum was on. What has changed since that time?
There's been a lot of changes, but we've still got a long way to go, which is why I've always promoted activism and human rights and freedom fighters, because of the terrible racism and cruelty that all of our First Nations families have endured, and especially yesterday being Sorry Day, when you hear all the sad stories, there's all of that unresolved grief, loss and trauma that mainstream Australia, many are finding it hard to come to terms with when they start hearing our stories. You know, just the stories that Norm tells and all those young people that were removed and sent to institutions and foster care, we're only hearing a minority of good stories that have come out. And so all of this trauma is still suppressed. So I have seen many changes. We've been kept a secret country, and the 67 referendum played a major role in letting the world know that firstly, there were black people and brown people, our mob in our country, as what Sister Tracy said. She witnessed with her own little eyes, seeing people of our colour running the show. And we've never had that opportunity. So I believe that with all the laws, with all the legislation, the Northern Territory intervention, all that, the whole world is watching now. And we've now got quite a number of white folks who have learned about the secret country. It's now becoming mandatory in the education system, the true history, because we can't reconcile without the true history. So we do have a long way to go, but we can't go back. We've got to keep going forward. I never thought in my time, as a 71-year-old woman soon, that I would see deadly black folks on the screen, and a lot of our wonderful students who strongly identify as Aboriginal and Islander and getting degrees, because 75 was the legal time for us to go to school. So I believe that massive change, and seeing pro-vice chancellors like yourself, Professor Fredericks, and all of these powerful people. I never ever thought I'd reach 70 with all the crazy activism in my life, getting bashed by the police, getting thrown into paddy wagons, jumping over Parliament House like I thought I was Houdini. And I look back and think, I can't have my 10 great-grandchildren doing this, but we can now do it in a more sophisticated way by education, finding out where we've come from, and we certainly know where we're going. Still a long way to go with the terrible statistics, but it has made massive changes from that slavery, that racism, to where we are today.
Yeah, powerful words, and lots of messages to share there with the audience too, about where we've come to where we are now today, and that there is a long way to go. And at this point, I just reflect that, this past Saturday, but 6 weeks before that, I was with a lot of people in Cairns and Yarrabah, and lots of young deadly people, and lots of older deadly people who were activists and elders too, and people from Land Council, and Dylan was there. But we did hear Auntie Grace from Pop Neal as well, from Yarrabah, who was one of the 67 campaign, and was one of those people that rallied and got people together, and we heard from him, and that inspired many of us who were there, all of us, I think, probably. I can't say all because that's generalization, but many of us who were there. And at that point, the gathering was just thinking and dreaming about the election, and an impending, perhaps, change of government, which is then what we saw, and then perhaps an announcement of forthcoming referendum. And that's where we are now, that we turn on the TV or turn on the radio, we look at social media, and we hear that, we see that, and there's already people now campaigning for that already, just like they did decades ago. I'm going to turn to you, Dylan, first, because you were part of that meeting and gathering in Cairns and Yarrabah. But what does it mean for us in terms of going forward for a referendum? What should we look out for, and what does it mean, and what kind of thing, how will it take place, and all those sort of things that I've got in my head running around, and uncertainty, and probably the other panelists have, but certainly those online and watching today might have too.
Yeah, sure. So there's just a basic sort of series of legal hurdles that need to be overcome for the referendum to succeed. The first one is you need to get legislation passed through both houses of Parliament, and that has to be with absolute majorities in Parliament. So a bill to change the Constitution. for a First Nations voice would have to get passed through both houses of Parliament. And then you have between 2 and 6 month sort of period in which there's a campaign, sort of a national debate campaign, and then it goes to referendum. So in order to be approved at a referendum, which is a vote of the Australian electors, it needs to be approved by an overall national majority of voters. And then it needs to be approved by majorities of voters in a majority of the states. That is to say, 4 out of the 6 states in Australia also need to approve it, because we've got a federal system. So it's kind of committed to letting the states have their say over constitutional change as well as at the national level. So that's the technical side of things. In terms of, what needs to happen politically to make that feasible, I mean, there's no going around the fact that you just need a lot of people supporting and getting behind the referendum. In 1967, this was the most successful referendum in Australian history. Over 90% of voters approved the constitutional change, which is remarkable. The evidence that we've seen from opinion polls suggests that there are also really large majorities of the Australian people who are willing to say yes in a referendum for a First Nations voice. But there's still a lot of hard work to do to make sure that that translates in a vote, in a referendum, in particular, making sure that, there's widespread political support among, the different political parties and at the state level too, because we know that the states, matter. Getting 4 out of 6 states to approve them, a referendum matters. So there's lots more to say about that. Questions around, do you need bipartisanship to get a referendum up these days, and the role of social media, but I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan. There's still, from what you're saying, there's a long way to go, and there's a lot of work to do, but also a lot of work that individuals perhaps need to do to think about what that means, and what they might need to do themselves. Arnie Graceland, what are you thinking about the election result, and in regards to the statements about having a referendum and changing the constitution?
Yeah, I'm quite pleased with the actual outcomes, because we need a change. What Dylan has spoken about is so very real. It's not going to be a shooting star overnight, because we've still got a long way to change the face of racism in this country. We've got a long way to go to change the mainstream media, who is still telling lots of stories about us in such negative stereotyping. We've got a long way to go in the different political parties and the 4 out of 6 states to win the vote. The 67 referendum, as Dylan said, and he's the little expert there with the law degree and sharp mind, it was amazing. Over 90% voted for us. But there are people for and against a referendum. And as I'm sure Dylan would tell us, I think there was 44 referendums in our country, and there was only about 8 successful. And my greatest fear as a political activist, an elder, that if the groundwork is not done appropriately, we can't fail in any referendum that gives us self-determination. So as you said, Dylan, we've got a long way to go. And the other thing I was reading, a lot of the Les Melzer spoke about, he was very concerned as an activist that let's get everyone just to go for this referendum, but it's not going to happen overnight. So we're hoping that this government which is quite well placed, is not going to forget about all the other issues that are plaguing our communities, as I said, with the high rates of heart disease and suicide and poor social determinants of health. We don't want all that energy, human and monetary resources, put in one bucket of educating white Australia. I remember my grandparents and all of your grandparents around the country that's been trying to educate white Australia. We've got to get rid of that real paternalistic colonial attitude within governments and around this country. Now, today, if any of you went to the sorry business, there was no dry eyes in the audience when one or two elders talked about their life. And that's what you heard is a snippet of what happened to every First Nations Australian family. So we need to keep working hard together. I'm not saying don't have a referendum, but if we don't do the groundwork appropriately, it could fail. And, people are saying, are you for the Eurostat? Of course I'm for treaty, voice and truth. I'm all for a referendum if it means there's going to be change to our young people's future towards real self-determination. But the groundwork must be done very accurately, very politically, very cultural. And as Malta said, you need government to get for and against the statement and give these debates at what we're doing right now with you, Professor Fredericks. But dreams can happen, but there's a hell of a lot of work to go. And I'm hoping we'll see that in my time because I've already outlived my bloody life expectancy.
Yeah, and that we celebrate together, that we all celebrate together. And I think you're right, there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done on the ground, good work to be done. There's also a bit of mischief making going on and misinformation being shared around about what it means, what it doesn't mean, that we cede sovereignty. Aboriginal Torres Strait people will cede sovereignty, and Professor Megan Davis has come out and others with, constitutional law experience and saying that doesn't mean that at all. That's misinformation. So we're probably going to see some of that coming forward, I also saw some clarity that, having a voice before we have treaties also ensures that treaties aren't as vulnerable, when they come about. So we're going to see a lot more information. I think it's about getting clarity. I'm going to bring it over now to you, Norm, to your thoughts on what the election result and what a referendum may mean or could mean, or what are you thinking about it at this time?
Well, it surprised me. I think it surprised a lot of people. It's one of those, I was listening to political debate, some political philosophers talk about it on the radio yesterday, and I was saying it's a watershed moment. And I think about, the 67 referendum, there was some huge events around that shamed Australia. They being, the Warburton events, the events of, Aboriginal kids dying of disease and starvation, that people like Uncle Doug Nichols brought to the forefront in Australia and showed people the violence that colonialism enacts in this silence that it builds. So that support and those things, reading back through it and understanding it as an academic, it was a movement that was really well constructed with a lot of allies. And I think that this election has shown that there are a lot of allies for Aboriginal people in Australia now. Professor Tracy Munder put on that wonderful thing at the Dewey Library, which was the looking at the papers. And I looked at Uncle Herb Wharton's papers and read them. And in those, I read stories from first contact in far west Queensland, the coming of the white men, and climate change, waterholes disappearing, dust clouds appearing in the sky, clearing of country, and the impact of cloven-hoofed animals on country, leaving tracks, changing everything, silting up waterholes. So climate change is not a new thing. It's something that goes in companion with colonialism. It's something everywhere where colonialism has gone. It has destroyed environments and changed climates. That's the sort of thing it does. And that has come out as a huge shift through the teal individuals, independents, actually targeting and speaking to climate change as something that can be addressed if we change the way we behave. And that change of behaviour for me is Australians learning how to be Indigenous. It's something that our uncles and aunties have said for many, many generations, that they don't know how to behave. And we all need to learn how to behave to address these problems.
Thanks.
And I think that's a great alliance to carry forward.
Yeah, thank you. There's some good learnings there for people who are watching today around that, and that they go together. Tracy Bunder.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and link this conversation together with what Gracelyn and Norm have said, but I'm also thinking about Linda Burney came into my mind. I'm so excited that Linda Burney is the minister for, first woman minister for, Indigenous woman minister for Indigenous Affairs. And so she's going to be very much a part of this process going forward. So I'm really happy about that. But I was also thinking about the statement, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. And it calls for an instrument for decision making, which we all interpret as a treaty. And it also calls for truth telling. Now, I sit within education. That's my discipline. And when I first saw that, I got very, very excited. And here I'll link to what Gracelyn was saying. Non-Indigenous people need to get more educated about Indigenous issues. And I'd like to be able to live a life within this country that the knowledge that we can give becomes just natural to people. So, you know, what Norm was saying, you know, how do non-Indigenous people centre within themselves that they live within an Indigenous country? And this Indigenous country has had eons of years of knowledge, not only to be able to run this country, you know, so the climate change issue out of the election, but be respectful to women. You know, that knowledge system was in place for our community since the beginning of time, and to look after the land and to be able to look after that the people. But I also recognise that in getting that education, there has to be some hard conversations. And whilst I see change, you know, like in my mum and dad's lifetime, they would be barred from entry into an establishment. They would be questioned, you know. My mum was. I mean, my dad was posted. Here he is, a serviceman serving the country, not yet a citizen of the country, but being posted to New Guinea after the war, and my mum being refused entry into the hotel up in Townsville as she was travelling to meet him, you know. And I think one of the things that we have to be challenged by is, if we're going to go forward together, is what does it mean to be human in this country? And there is a lot of work to do, because we are so dependent upon the country, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always had that relationship with country, and non-Indigenous people, our people have been saying forever, why people have got ears and why aren't they listening? And so that's part and parcel of the hard conversation. And that's what we've got to have going forward. We haven't been mature as a nation to be able to have those hard conversations because the activist voice was always crushed. It was imprisoned. It was silenced, you know? And we need to be able to, you know, that's what truth telling will have to be. Thanks, Bronnie.
Thank you, Tracy. That was great too. You know, there's people often hear, what do you think about it? When they get that opinion back, they don't quite like it, so they get a bit upset, but they ask the opinion. But it is about not being used to it and learning how to. From what we've heard this afternoon, you know, we can see that there's lots of conversations. Arnie Grace has talked about the groundwork needing to be done, and Norm's talked about other things that kind of, you know, have been going part and parcel, and people's different voting according to what spoke to them, different groups coming forward. We hear some of the things from Tracy about the fear, you know, people's fears and worry, or, you know, not knowing enough and then needing to be educated enough. And, you know, we also see misinformation too. So part of the truth telling is about misinformation and to be moving forward. Dylan, I'm coming back to you just to get some final words from you around what can we expect to see? Like, what will we expect to see, for example, next week or in the weeks ahead, and then in the months ahead? What can we expect to see with the announcement of this commitment and that the Prime Minister is moving forward towards a referendum? What can we see?
Look, I think in terms of just the logistics and practicalities of moving to a referendum, you need to settle on a few things. First of all, you need to settle on what changes are actually going to be made to the Constitution. And that is a question of translating, you know, the Uluru Statement's call for a First Nations voice to Parliament into some more, I guess, technical legal language that sort of fits within the Constitution. People who have been campaigning on this since the Uluru Statement was handed down, like Professor Megan Davis and others, Arnie Pat Anderson, have been working tirelessly in that time, coming up with proposed wording for the constitutional changes. So there has been work done, but that will need to be decided upon. There'll have to be a decision about the question that gets put in the referendum as well. So what will the voters be asked when they go ahead to vote? And the form of the question, you know, may be important. There may need to be some changes to the way that referendums are actually conducted. There was a parliamentary inquiry into that last year, and there are just some issues to do with, you know, how they're funded, the kinds of materials that people get exposed to, the fact that, you know, the lack of engagement of you know, the Australian Electoral Commission and other institutions through social media and so on, and sort of digital means. So there are some issues to be settled with that. And then also, you know, the date of the referendum. You know, when is that going to happen? There have been a few ideas proposed, and I think there are lots of complicated political machinations around that are sort of, or calculations that are beyond my pay grade to think about. But I think, at least for a lot of, or I would say for a lot of the campaigners who are pushing for a referendum, it has to be this term, and it has to, I would say probably earlier is seen as better, just while there's still a bit of a bit of momentum, there's still a bit of political capital and goodwill with this government, and you're not getting too close to you know, another election down the track. So sort of getting that locked up. But obviously, you know, that on the other hand, you also need, as Professor Graceland said, you also need to do the really hard work of making sure that this referendum succeeds, and that takes time. So, yeah.
Thanks, Dylan. I think there's a few messages there from Dylan about the hard work and timing. Take-home messages, Dylan, 3 things for people, the audience.
Oh, gosh.
3 take-home messages. Others think about it as I'm asking Dylan. Come back to you.
Okay.
Said one about the groundwork.
Yeah. Another one, look, I would just say for people who are interested and committed to this getting up, go to the uluru-statement.org website, sign up there, and there are a whole range of ways that you can get involved, and the website gives people guidance on how to do that. That's 2 things. I'll have a think if I can come up with a set.
All right, that's okay. Tracy, 3 things that people can do to take away from today.
Educate yourself, read, and then when you think you're finished, read some more. So there are a whole bunch of authors there. Read Graceland's stuff, read Norm's stuff, read Bronwyn's stuff, read my stuff, and look who they're referencing so you can read their stuff. Watch the programs on TV, watch The Drum, watch, Four Corners, watch NITV, that's all there. And I think my 3rd one is, black fellas in this country have had no choice but to be brave. You want to stand with us? Be brave.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I love that. I love it. Norm, Professor Norm Sheehan.
That's a big axe to follow. Hey, I agree with all those. I think there's a couple of things that have come forward just from the politics where people said, oh, we've all got to care for country. Oh, that's easy. Aboriginal people have been doing it for thousands of years. So, of course, that's going to be easy for white fellas to do. It's actually not easy. It's not easy to put country first. It's actually very difficult. It's very difficult to put people first as well, because you find you have to give up a lot of things that if you put country and people first that are not good for the whole. So I'm thinking about well-being and throwing to Auntie to finish this off, because she's been in the forefront of this for generations. I think having the courage to do that, I agree with Bronwyn, and then putting well-being first and your own well-being, sitting out on country, whether you're white or black, and taking notice of what's around you, because country has a capacity to teach. And then connecting with people, and being humble when you connect. Even if you're old like me, I get I get blanks in the memory. I can't remember names. So it's good to see you all. It's good to see you, Arnie. They're my 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Norm. It's lovely. Arnie Graceland, come to you.
I'll be real quick. First of all, I
last.
thank all your darling panel, and thank you again, Professor Bronwyn. And I look at little Tracy. She's still on fire. I used to watch her activism and thought, geez, she's on fire. And I love you very much, Trace.
Thank you.
And all of you. But very quickly, my 3 points: absolutely get involved to educate the non-First Nations people. If we can change one white fella's attitude of not liking us to understanding and liking us, we're winning the battle of this ugly racism. 2, we got to spread the word. And 3, I've been privileged of 55 years of nursing and midwifery and doing a lot of alternative healing. And I never, ever get by without telling the nurses, the doctors, our mob, that as a midwife, if you contaminate your womb, she will cease to create life. We've had 100,000 years of passing down that our womb is Mother Earth. You contaminate Mother Earth, she not only will cease to create life, she will take her wrath out. And that's why it's so important that our young people have got to get off that Facebook, fighting each other over the bullshit Native Title Act, and get involved with looking after Mother Earth and your spirit will be balanced and at peace with each other. And as Norm said, it's not easy, but we got to keep fighting. As Tracy said, we've had no choice. So we got to keep on keeping on. And thank you for giving me the honour and privilege of being on this amazing panel. Watamuli.
Watamuli, Auntie Grace. That's our panel for today. And I do want to thank the speakers today, Dr. Dylan Leno, Professor Tracy Bunder, Professor Norm Sheehan, and Professor Auntie Graceland Smallwood for joining me today for this panel and conversation around 55 years on the 1967 referendum, and also looking at the current referendum discussions that are happening now and the ways forward.